This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical method. Today's conversation is with Gabrielle Williams, who teaches in the Department of Literary Studies at the New School for Social Research. She is a dancer and vocalist whose scholarly work explores the question of hunger in Africana literature, a question that guides her book manuscript, tentatively entitled Starving from Satiety. In this conversation, we discuss the relationship between embodiment, expressive culture, and Black studies, and how the study of Black life shifts and grounds the meaning of education and the imagination of the classroom. Hello, Gabrielle. How are you today?
I am good. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. I'm really excited to have you on as part of the series for a lot of reasons. Really interested to hear about your work, to think with you about how you think about the field of Black studies and your work in relation to it, think about the history and future of the field. Also, I'm really always a little bit extra happy when someone has done their PhD in the field, which I just think is such an important part of thinking about the past, present, and future of Black studies, because I think so many of us have come through a discipline to Black studies, but people with PhDs in the field I've found in these conversations and in my own workspace have a really important perspective. So for all of those reasons, thank you for making the time. I really appreciate it. I also know it's the beginning of the semester, so it's not an easy time to get started on these kinds of things.
Yeah, you are most welcome. Happy to be here.
Well, let me start with, we'll get into the field of Black studies and your work in a moment, but I wanted to start with really like a more personal question, if you will, and ask you to talk a little bit about what drew you to the study of Black life, what drew you to Black studies, and for me, always this really interesting question of, what sustains you in relation to both?
The most honest answer to that question is my upbringing in Crenshaw, Los Angeles, California, predominantly Black neighborhood and definitely a ghettoized and sort of blighted and very dangerous neighborhood. I grew up in the 80s, and so gang culture was quite a real thing. And the kind of lessons that, normatively, I suppose, one learns when they're a little bit older, you learn very, very young there about life and death and about danger and about the stakes of things being more about things that are connected to survival rather than life or quality of life and that kind of thing. So growing up in that way with a single parent mother in low income sort of situations, it really, I was I was the same version of who I am now, but a kid. So obviously I didn't have a PhD or a lot of fancy words to sort of articulate what I was seeing, but it just struck me as incredibly confusing, and I was very, very interested as to why, in particular, we Black people, were in this kind of a situation, whereas other people that I saw were not. And so, to that last little bit, I was growing up definitely in that neighborhood, but my mom was the type of person who worked pretty hard to kind of give me a job from like the time I was 5 to be really, really good at school, really, really good in the arts, so that I could get scholarships to go to private schools and get out of that neighborhood, at least for a few hours out of the day. And so it was rather a rich man, poor man thing that was going on. I went to schools in super wealthy areas, and then I came home. And it just, I don't know, that installed, I suppose, the question that could be, inclusive of so many questions, but primarily kind of hearkening back to Du Bois. What is it to be a problem? What is it to feel like a problem? What is it to live as problematized? And what is it to kind of walk with two-ness, where you see yourself um, from such a young age as the sort of socio-political and economic entity that you are, that is colored a certain color, and that color seems to be attached to those kind of like conditions, and then to just be a human being that philosophically wants to just get down with like getting lost in your thoughts and walking around and figuring out what it is to be alive and all of that sort of thing. So it was, I suppose, that background, it installed in me a sort of conflict that on one side was existential and on the other side was more ideological, kind of comprising those factors or markers of the economic, the political, the sociological, and the cultural.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious what it was like to read those opening paragraphs of Souls, to encounter them. As you said, I mean, this was your experience, and I think that because it's those I often, especially if I teach introductory level courses in Africana studies, always teach Du Bois, and it's so hard to get outside of those first couple of paragraphs. I think because for so many students, exactly what you're saying. It's that century plus, resonance of that. What does it mean to be a problem, but also what does it mean to walk as two?
Yeah. um, excuse me. When I first engaged Souls myself, now see, here's where things get a little bit uh, uh, necessitating of some explanation. So, in my upbringing, the private school thing, which was my job to be good at, was one thing. But the other thing was to be very, very, very good, which I became very, very good at dance. So I also got into scholarship situations in very fancy dance schools. And in that way, I had a relationship to my body and to the situation that I've just described, that kind of existential questioning, where in which the kind of first tendrils of what I would say really is the primary foundation of my research and my research questions came. My research surrounds tracing the phenomenology of hunger in African American novels, pretty much of the 20th century, but also the 21st century. So, in other words, the quick and dirty of that is I look at situations where I am always thinking about the body that either is in a situation of de jure slavery or de facto slavery, the Black body as that. And I ask the question pretty much of what is it to be in a situation where you do not own your body, and so therefore you do not own your belly, and so therefore you do not own not only your satiation or satisfaction from eating or from consumption, but you also do not own your hunger. You also do not own your sense of starvation in an embodied sense. So, going back to the first encounter with Du Bois, and right now I'm going to paraphrase a bit wrongly, but it wasn't even so much the double consciousness that got me, or the what is it to be a problem. What really got me were the lines where he says something along the lines of sort of the the two-ness affects you in such a way where you are dragging your body as dogged existence. Like, it's those sort of words are there.
Yeah.
And it was that piece that really got me because, of course, in the way that I grew up, being low income, I was, of course, often hungry or often eating bad leftovers or whatever it was, this kind of a thing. But I also noticed that in my neighborhood, we were the poorest people. I knew this. We were hungry, but it seemed that people that I was around, as well as myself, we were more hungry for metaphysical foods of justice, catharsis, sovereignty,
Hmm.
ease of life, the ability to wake up and think, how would I like my day to be? Rather than to know that your day is going to be such and this and that, and therefore you live in these ways, you know?
Yeah.
So it was really the dogged existence, the kind of dragging your own body around as a result of this two-ness and of this, what is it to be a problem and problematized existence, as if your body were a heavy appendage that was indeed disembodied from you. And that sort of corresponds with how I think about the ontology of eating, the phenomenology of hunger, when I am researching books like Their Eyes Are Watching God or Beloved or Native Son. So I really hit these kind of like darlings of the 20th century African American literary canon. But I hit them in such a way where I am looking to apply a sort of fresh theorization of their content, vis-a-vis these ideas of surrounding ontology of eating, phenomenology of hunger, and what I call starving from satiety, which is the title of the manuscript.
Yeah, wow. No pressure, but you have to publish this. This is, I think, incredibly important and interesting. I mean, I love the title, but yeah, what a fantastic topic. I want to hear you talk about how you think about that in relation to Black studies in some detail in a moment. But let me maybe pause that just for a second and ask you, getting to the field of Black studies and our imagination of it. As you know, I mean, the birth of Black studies has this tension at its foundation, which is the demand by students to have a place in education systems, courses, majors, departments, etc., as well as intellectuals, where the Black intellectual tradition could be developed, studied, appreciated, and so forth. And that's been a huge part of the impact of Black studies has been to develop that tradition. But that same demand came at a time when, post-civil rights, when Black liberation struggle had really questioned all these distinctions between, say, the campus and the community, between learning and radical action. Mm-hmm. And so there's also this origin of Black studies, which is a political demand, which is prescriptive rather than descriptive and engaged with intellectual traditions. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to say that they're contradictions, but there's a tension there. And there's always been a tension, I think, inside the field of Black studies, just how we do and how we ought to imagine the field. But that was 54, 55 years ago. That in this origin story. And so I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit about how you imagine the field of Black studies in light of that origin story in, I almost said 2024, 2025.
Yeah, I keep making that mistake too. It always takes me a couple weeks in the new year.
I think it's going to take me like 3-4 months.
Yeah.
I'm bad.
All right. John, this is a big question, how I imagine the field of Black studies. Well, so how I imagine it at its most ideal, I suppose. Is that the question?
How you imagine it at any level. I mean, I think the ideal is interesting, but also sort of ways in which we're called to practice it as educators and intellectuals.
Okay. The latter part. Yeah. So I am finding this. The student populations that I serve are expressly coming out of COVID. They're coming out of pandemic culture, and they're also coming out of a highly politicized culture, where for some of them, their only outings during lockdown were going to Black Lives Matter marches or going to #MeToo marches or end gun violence marches, or, these sorts of things. And they also were doing this in ways where their experiences of things in group activism were sort of counterbalanced in an imbalanced way, in that they didn't have a public and a polity to go home to after the marches. They went home to their apartments or their parents' house or wherever they were living at the time, and sort of like maintain, whether we were in hard or soft lockdown toward those ending months, maintained a sort of subjective relationship to a hugely kind of like public set of politics that they were adopting. And then they came into college live,
Yeah.
and they came in this way where Black Studies at the New School University is really not a thing. They don't have a freestanding department. I came in as a hire through the longest name in the world, the Andrew W. Mellon Initiative for increasing faculty excellence in areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion at the New School. Bah, that's the whole name.
You were right. I was like, oh, but there's longer.
I know.
I think
It's
that's
the longest name in the world. It's the longest name in the world. And it's very apropos of New School, like so weird and long and weird. So I came in as someone that was hired as a postdoc researcher for a couple of years, and then an assured full-time tenure track faculty that would begin to teach me after those first 2 years of research. That did not happen. I started teaching very soon after I arrived because of the need in the department, and my specialization in all of these things in the kind of like world of Black studies, the things that I do, put me in a situation where the Black population of students and the even, I would say, BIPOC population of students at the New School is not high, And so what happened was that every student of color, every Black identifying student, every student that was interested in all the things that I do sort of flocked to my classes, and also flocked to me as a kind of mentor, as a kind of counselor, as a kind of like, wow, you get me. Like, I'm the only Black person in my class. Like, you're the only Black professor I've ever encountered here that's teaching Black studies, like that sort of thing. But even though I am, going on a bit here, I'm staying on task, I think, in answering your question, in that the expectation of Black studies must respond to the transparent and naked questions of students or statements of students that say things like, you're the only Black professor that has taught Black studies, and I have had a problem with the fact that that has not been the case. Please advise me. Please do something about that. Please, there has to be, as a professor, an openness to actually not only receiving that question, but considering that question in such ways where one really must do something about it.
Mm-hmm.
And one really must not be the kind of superordinating professor that tells the student something that's like equivocating, that essentially sort of shines them on as like, oh, you young whippersnapper, I get it, blah, blah, blah. Like, there's no more of that in this generation. Like, there's that cannot be when one is teaching Black studies. There has to be an active commitment to not only talking the talk, but walking the walk of the things that you teach, period.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you took it in that direction. It's super interesting. And I think back on, this, by the time, when yours comes out, it will be in the 80s in terms of numbers of podcasts. And so often in talking about, imagining the field of Black studies and sort of how ought it be structured, or what are we sort of called, or how are we called to be positioned in this kind of work, that word community often is central. And I understand because it's also at the origins of the field, questions of community and campus. But one of the things that I rarely hear talked about, which I was hearing you talk about, was a sense in which the community is right at our office door.
Yeah.
And what does it mean to think as an educator?
Yeah.
Right? Really seriously. That's why when I said, as an educator, as a writer, teacher, and that educator part is, linking that to a sense of community, not as I teach my classes and then I go outside the campus, as if this campus doesn't have communities, as you said, with these very intense needs. I mean, University of Maryland, where I teach, is, it's very different student demographics. Nevertheless, what a Black Studies course means, lines up with so much, and, depending on the professor, lines up with so much of everything of what you just said. And, making efforts or just forgetting that is an immediate community has always struck me as something that's really odd. I mean, I write a lot, but I really identify primarily as an educator. That's what I care most about.
Yeah.
And that's such an intense sense of community, and the way you put that in, I want to say like deeply moral and political terms, but that was just really existential. I mean, talk about the meaning of my existence is being spoken in this word to my professor.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, this might be a little bit non sequitur, but I am a big fan of Martin Buber, and I'm thinking about I and thou right now. And I'm thinking about the way in which several times throughout that book, he describes the I and thou, which is sort of, if you're not familiar with Buber, not you, but like listeners, it's just a sort of another iteration of self-other, in terms of continental, but kind of like moving more toward existential phenomenological with Buber, right? But he speaks about those moments in which one finds a either dyadic or dialectic or whatever sort of duality that can indeed be transcended to come to another sort of plateau or stair step of resolve, right? He describes that as one must body oneself forward. It's a bodying. Like, it's this lovely, lovely use of the word body as noun and verb, body oneself forward. And there is something that resonates with me about what you're saying about community and about that last thing you said. It's really existential in that immediate exchange between the student and the professor, or students and the professor, speaking about these sort of things, where it's sort of like, I need to be recognized as part of the part of I should say, intellectual community in which we are engaging in teaching and learning, not where in which you're standing over there as the teacher and I am the learner, like a kind of Freirian, sort of like savings account that you're banking knowledge into. No, it cannot be that. There's something where in which that answer to the problem, or to the question, or to the demand, or to the need is not solved in that immediate moment. And certainly it's not solved co-extensively or co-relationally. However, there is an opportunity to continue to body oneself forward in the mush of either the dyad or the dialectic or the chiasmus or whatever sort of duality that is. You still keep it moving, and you keep it moving not as I am separate from you, student, as the professor, but as we will work on this.
Yeah, no, I love that. I'm tempted to go on my own side road on that. I was raised by LA hippies, so third generation born, Echo Park. But I remember seeing, as a kid, as a teenager, my mother had a collection of books stuck in a cabinet, and I and Thou was actually one of them. And I remember reading it, and I had clueless. I was like 16, 17, but I used to carry it around in my back pocket because I thought it looked like a cool book.
Yes, that's so cool. That's so cool.
I will say that if I was going to trace, because I had, it's not my therapy session, but truly checked out awful parents. But the one thing that made me think, like, I could see myself doing something was something about carrying I and thou and reading it, and it seemed like, oh, what if I was a person who actually could understand this book?
That's amazing.
But I really love that. I mean, I think there's something about about the Black Studies classroom that has a different sense of encounter when we take it really seriously. And I myself, I've taught in other, I taught for the first, 8 or 9 years of my career in philosophy departments, and they're very different classrooms. I think they have, each has their virtues, but that sense of I think when a Black Studies classroom is really authentically what it is and what it should be, that I-thou relationship is much more intense. And I don't think it's reducible to the way I think we talk about it in popular sort of professor complaint culture of, they're taking up my time, or I'm doing too much extra labor. I understand that absolutely happens. I'm not like dismissing that. But I think there's this other dimension that you're really speaking to in a really profound way. So, that comes as a special feature of a Black Studies classroom, maybe to an area studies classroom broadly, but I think in a Black Studies classroom, that's my only experience. That's really profound. So I really appreciate that comment. I'm be thinking about it for a while.
Oh, good. I'm glad it's useful. Sometimes I feel like I just bang on and on. Like, I'm so, like, my brain is just always going. So, yes, but I try to stay on task.
Well, I mean, my PhD was in post-World War II Jewish philosophy. So,
there you go.
Way in the olden days, Buber and responses to Buber was a part of my my daily writing and teaching life.
Amazing.
Well, let me shift a little bit to ask you about your work. You've spoken a bit about it, or more than a bit about it, where you work really with cultural theory, literary methods, and interested in everyday practices and the way they show up in, literary and cultural texts. And, there's so much to be learned and gained in the field of Black studies from this collection of approaches. And so I'm interested to hear you reflect, as the person doing that work, how you think your work fits in the history of the field of Black studies, but also what new horizons you think it might be opening up.
Well, I have described my intellectual work, and I can go back to that happily. But, John, I will tell you, in terms of some of the other hats that I wear beyond professor at the New School. So one of those hats is that the provost of the New School, Renee T. White, started an initiative this year called the Provost Faculty Fellow Initiative. She's chosen 2 faculty members across all the colleges at the university, and I am one of them, to do things that just kind of increase cultures of care, belonging, EISJ principles, DEI principles, that sort of thing. So, John, what I am doing is a speaker series called Pedagogy as Praxis. It's different installments of 3-part conversations between different people that do different things in the academy. So the first one was in November. It was a conversation between Melissa Nobles, Chancellor of MIT, and Renee White, the Provost of New School, with a Professor Mia White from the New School. These are all Black identifying women. And that was about sort of like the nuts and bolts of higher education, and what it was really to sort of like come through a sort of trajectory for these Black women of a certain age. So, they're like of a certain age, I'll just say that. During times where they were at the Ivies, let's say getting a PhD in the 80s, and it was just like atrocious, not only to be a woman, but particularly to be a Black woman. So that was one of them. The next one that I'm doing is a conversation between Nona Hendricks and an amazing contemporary modern dancer and maker of art called Edissa Weeks, moderated by Gail Fichetti, who is over at College of Performing Arts at the New School. So I don't know if you know who Nona Hendricks is, but she was one of the founding members of the group LaBelle, who did Lady Marmalade, but she's also done all this crazy work on her own, like worked with David Byrne, Laurie Anderson, Gary Lucas from Captain Beefheart, Buster Poindexter, like on and on and on and on. Laura Nero, Annie DeFranco, all of this. So that's the thing. But then the last thing I'll describe is the one that I'm actually going to be moderating, facilitating the discussion between Erica Huggins and my lifelong and amazing mentor of everything, Dr. Eula White Taylor, who's the chair of African American African Diaspora Studies at UC Berkeley, where I got my PhD. So that little synopsis was just to sort of foreground how I see what I do sort of changing the face, of Black studies, education, whatever. These 3-person discussions for me, obviously the discussants are amazing, period. And they're going to have an amazing impact on the audience, period. But the other thing going on is that, it's so amazing when we have, for instance, last year we had Cornel West, Slavoj Žižek, Sarah Ahmed come to the school and speak. I was sort of instrumental in getting those speakers that I've just named. The thing, though, is that they come for 90 minutes, they're amazing, and then they leave. And then undergraduate student populations in particular are like coming to you or me saying like, hey, Prof, last name, do you think if I email Cornel West, he'll get back to me? And the answer is like, sadly, no. So in these things, these 3-person conversations, they always include someone who is housed at the new school. And so in that way, it gives audience members a chance to feel like they have an on-site takeaway, where in which if they have questions, comments, if they want to talk about it, chop it up, whatever it is, they have access to someone who's there. And I'm choosing people and sort of curating these different talks in such a way where these are people that have literally lived, they have lived the praxis of what they have done intellectually or artistically or so on and so forth. And so that's part of what I'm interested in doing in education, in Black studies, in all of it, to sort of like change it, through my own work, through my own kind of research and my own background. So,
Yeah,
and the book is the book, Yeah.
By the way, Eula Taylor is going to be on the podcast series.
Oh, that's amazing. Eula is my everything. She's my everything. She was my dissertation chair. She's my life mentor. She's everything.
Well, it's I'm not sure when it's scheduled because it's on Ashley's schedule, but great. More Berkeley representation.
Yeah.
So let me ask, and this connects to all these conversations about classroom, about text, about practices in the on the edges and at the center of campus. But you did your PhD work in a Department of African Diaspora Studies, and now you work in a literary studies department, which I do think this literary studies or English in many other universities is kind of interesting because although it's a discipline, it's also it's also where you see film and cultural studies often getting taught. But just at a formal level, right? Your doctoral work was in an area study, right? And where you work now is maybe a more disciplinary home, right? But also maybe not. And I'm just interested in how you think about both your thinking and your teaching, how it's been impacted by essentially unfolding outside of conventional or traditional disciplines. Like, how does that impact the way you construct a classroom? How do you think it's impacted?
How does the area study affect the disciplinary modalities?
Or just your own thinking and your own teaching, because you haven't come from, say, a history department to.
Well, John, I have a master's in African American studies. I have a master's in anthropology of food, and I have the PhD in African American African diaspora studies. So I'm drawing from a lot of like different sort of fields. Yeah. And I also did the master's in anthropology over in the UK, which is a whole other ball of worms, intellectually speaking, in terms of where they're coming from, as it were, toward anthropology. But it was at SOAS, so it was like really cool and really liberatory, the thing. So given all of that, I even the African diaspora, the doctorate piece, I was already working with like literature, I was working on whatever the nascent little buds of what I'm doing the manuscript on right now are or were. Um, I also come from, um, I mean, my background in dance was heavily, heavily disciplined. I went to Laksha Performing Arts High School, which is sort of like it's a cool thing and it's an awesome thing, but that is a serious place, like you are learning like the not only movements, but the philosophies of like, everyone from Martha Graham to Lester Horton to Catherine Dunham. And that means that when you're learning those things, you're also learning anthropology, which takes you over to like seeing how there's resonances between, let's say, Catherine Dunham and Zora Neale Hurston and like Mules and Men and like things like that. So, and you're just like, well, anyway, was just this little 16-year-old, like, oh, this is part of it all. And then when I studied at Alvin Ailey, it was the same thing. Heavy, heavy, heavy kind of like not only philosophy of dance, but also the physical, the movements of dance and all of that. And so that really impacted me as well. Music impacted me as well. So I'm a trained jazz vocalist. So that's a whole other ball of discipline and, whatever. So honestly, for me, it is all of the kind of disciplinary things that I bring into the classroom with me today. All of those disciplinary kind of threads inform what I do in the classroom. So, for instance, I'm in literary studies, but like moving into this semester, for instance, I'm teaching one class on Edward Glissant and poetics. I'm teaching one class called Ugly, Distorted Aesthetics of Exquisite Blackness. And I'm teaching another class called Flies in the Buttermilk, Food, Power, and Hunger in Africana Literature. And in all of those different classes, I am using music and film. I am using, obviously, novels and novellas. But for instance, like in Flies in the Buttermilk, I'm using River Solomon's their novella, The Deep. But that means that I'm also looking at cutting with, Daveed Diggs, the experimental hip hop group's performance of The Deep, which Rivers and Cutting got together to do. And so that means that we're looking at the video for it as well. And so you see what I mean? And it's kind of like you're dealing with an Afrofuturist text. So you're also dealing with teaching baseline theory about Afrofuturism. And then the big, big, big question is always amongst students like, well, what's the difference between Afrofuturism and Afropessimism? Oh, and by the way, what is Afropessimism? Like, on and on. And then you have to like account for like, I'm using Nathaniel Mackey text, in one sense. So it's like, but what's the difference between Mackey and this one and, that kind of thing. So it's on and on and on and on. And so, yeah, I mean, I suppose just from that little bit of like the course descriptions, you can see how all of these different sort of disciplines, although area kind of based versus this is the traditional discipline of blah, 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 sort of deal. They sort of funnel through me in such a way where I can create what my students have told me, thank God, is not just a mishmash of circuitous nonsense that no one can follow in a syllabus from start to finish of the semester, but things that are actually salient and like sexy and progressive and interesting and all over the place that feel though like they are perfectly imperfect and that they are perfectly imperfect in such ways as is the human experience, so that students can always at least come back to that kind of point as a place where when they feel like, oh my God, I do not understand what's going on in this Fred Moten text. The whole class structure of being perfectly imperfect is just a safe haven where it's like, okay, but I can start at square one. I can go to that first place of like, everything is going on. So if everything is going on, let me just dive in and try again.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, John, the thing that I want to do for a lot of reasons, certainly intellectually and scholastically, but also because that's the 2 a.m. moment when the student is sitting in their dorm room and I'm not with them. And they might have 1,000 other things going on in their life that are bumming them out. And they might feel like a failure. And they might feel like, oh my God, I'm this smart student and I've always been so smart, but now I can't even understand, the first paragraph of, Lisant's Poetics. Like, what's going on? And, it is that. It is that I want there. The perfectly imperfect safe haven where the headiness of abstracted thought from a lot of different sort of disciplinary areas can collectivize in such a way where it always lands, as meaningful and as something that can be understood.
Yeah, as a theorist who teaches so much theoretical stuff in the classroom, I mean, I know that student moment, and I really work hard to protect them against, do what I can to protect them against that 2 a.m. Self-destructive mode of I'm not smart enough for this.
Yeah.
I always tell them, though, it was an advice that I got when I was an undergraduate. The professor had said, you won't understand all of what you read, but that's why I'm the teacher, right? That's why we have class. But he said, make sure you read the words anyway, even if you just look at them, because that way when I say aporia, that's a technical word and not somebody's name. Because if you didn't read, you don't even know. And students usually laugh. And I say sometimes just knowing the difference between a technical term and a name is a victory with the reading,
Yeah.
But also, the way you were describing all of these things that are coming together in your classroom, as well as your research and as well as your, like, I don't know how else to put it, but your formation as like a thinker and actor in the world. There are so many different places where these things that really matter can anchor. And I think the Black Studies classroom, I do have students sometimes who are like, what is going on? I mean, we're talking about this, Usman Samben film, and then we're like reading a text by, Ralph Ellison, and then we're reading something by Aimé Césaire, and they're like, we're sort of all over the place. And I say, look, this is a liberated classroom in its own way. And one of the forms of liberation is the way this scattering of ways to anchor your own thinking. We all anchor in the same place in some way. That's why it's a class. But these multiple ways in I think it's a really beautiful thing. I certainly like teaching it. I mean, there's something really fun about, a film one week, a critical essay the next, a short story, experimental dance piece, whatever it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, let me ask about just a retrospective and sort of present assessment of the field of Black Studies. What do you think that the history of Black Studies as a field, what do you think the field has done well? But what do you think the field has not done particularly well?
I think that the field, and John, this is coming from my experience. So going to conference or give a talk at like all kinds of universities all over the world, like these sorts of things. So I've been around in that way. And what I have seen is that Black Studies has not always been successful. Let's say, oh my God, this is hard. Let's just say there's certain Ivy Leagues that have Black Studies graduate programs in which you cannot do a Black Studies related any kind of advanced degree unless you are harnessing that degree to one of the traditional disciplines. That kind of structure is problematic for me. Yes. Black Studies has sometimes not not separated quite. A scenario where in which Black studies classes are not immediately and automatically spaces for Black activist movements and organizations. I mean, the planning of the machinations of organization and mobilization. It hasn't always done that quite well. And again, I'm talking about being all over the place. I'm talking about being at community colleges where in which you go into the classroom and it smells like vaguely of like incense and like cat pee and there's like underfunding and like all sorts of things going on, but it's
The
like
incense never covers up
it's
the cat pee.
yeah, it's just like a vibe, all the way up to Ivy League. Like this place looks like a cathedral, this class, or whatever. And I'm talking about both of those spaces where in which the conflation between Black studies as a field of studies that is inclusive of many, many, many amazing outlooks and canons and libraries surrounding Black activism exists, and one where in which the Black studies class is itself a space that is supposed to be an active sort of like canonical engine for mobilization of Black political activism. That has not always been great. What has also not always been great is the way in which look, now there are just fights in every field, in every academic field. Fights meaning like, look, I'll just keep it safe and say, let's go with like the old Negro versus the new Negro type of deal. Let's say Du Bois versus Garvey. Let's say, the Black Baptist Church versus the Nation of Islam, like things like that. Let's say Black men who are heteronormative and masculinist and misogynist, and Black women who are in the same activist cause for mobilization. And one just cannot allow to remain unchecked their misogyny, their anti-feminine, whatever is going on. Things like that. Those kind of things have also been things that I've seen. But what it's done right is in all of those not so great scenarios that I've just spun, what's done right is that oftentimes I have seen people, professors, department chairs, chancellors, depending on what kind of university you're at, be able to really be amenable to autocorrection and to install change. And because Black studies departments are often so replete with people that are willing to be active in making change, the changes actually do occur quite quickly and quite thoroughly and quite transparently and honestly and unapologetically, and I've seen that. I've also, I think, for the benefits, and this might be a little bit, I don't know, confusedly framed. I'm going to try not to be that way, but Black studies from the third world education time and the liberation of, the university in 1968 and the installation of Black studies at SF State and things like that, right? Since those days, right, there has been an immediate sort of occurrence where in which the moment that Black studies was installed as a grad program at UC this or blah, blah, that, there was a demand also for the decolonization of Black studies when it was installed in the colonial setting, which is, of course, the institution. And so it was a call not only for the decolonization, of course, of Black studies, which that wasn't really the point. It was more about this call for a decolonization of the institution of education and higher education in particular itself. And it has very well, Black studies has very well negotiated and continued a meaningful kind of like progress, in that kind of strange demand.
Mhm.
It can, yes, it seems oxymoronic, it seems woefully paradoxical, but it isn't actually. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was you said confusedly put. I love that was very precisely put. And I think that's an ongoing thing. I mean, versions of this have come up in so many of these podcasts about thinking what it means to be inside an institution, but also somehow in the way you got, your pathway into that building, right,
Yeah.
is lined with the imperative to make the institution completely different.
That's right.
And how do we think that relationship? Because we want jobs, we want stability, we can't be going in and out of existence.
Yeah.
But also, as you were, put it so well, I mean, it's there's a deeper charge here. That Black Studies was not supposed to be the Band-Aid that allowed something to heal. It was supposed to be, something that went in and disrupted and fundamentally reshaped. I think there are there are some disciplines that have been really deeply reshaped by Black Studies. I think literature, like English departments,
absolutely,
and history departments as well. Others not so quick to adjust, but
yeah,
it's a long process. But also, how to what extent are we engaged as members of an intellectual and campus community in Black Studies? How much are we actually engaged in that work? I mean, that's the question I really heard animating what you said, and it's a hard one, and I think we all have to ask it.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we really do have to rethink, what do we mean by the phrase Black Studies?
Well, sure. Yeah. 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 This is sort of my favorite thing. I was going to say to think about, but it's more so to sort of like, for the 100th and 1,000th time, notice is always a palimpsest set of concerns and ideas and issues and topics running around in the back of my head, Yeah.
Well, let me ask you a concluding question, and that's to sort of bring it back to your own sense of imagination, urgency, and so forth. Whatever the future of the field is in our institutional context, which I think, as we are recording this just a handful of days before a far-right government comes into power, so that, in an institutional context, what's its future is a question, right? We'll see. But in that institutional context, right, the field, our presence on campuses, our presence in communities, what is the question do you think is most urgent and you want us to be asking? What is the issue you think is most urgent and want us to all be thinking about?
Particularly in considering this new government, which is, I won't even go into that, but okay. So
I think a lot of us can fill in the blanks.
Yeah. The person who will be occupying the commander-in-chief situation of sitting in the seat of the president, this chap, Trump, right? He is quite good at harnessing a very kind of charged topic or thing and turning it into a propaganda campaign against itself. In that way, I think that paying close attention to the way in which perhaps for the gain of public opinion or certain constituencies, this particular president might sort of harness Black and Blackness and Black activism and Black Lives Matter and things like that toward a kind of like um, appearance of like embracing it as something in which he believes so deeply, and in terms of like progressing it and like being proactive about it, but actually does it in such a way where in which it creates avarice and divisions and divisiveness amongst Black polities and constituencies, themselves, right? I think that things like that, like bait and switch games with media and news and fake news and propaganda as it relates particularly to the term Black and Blackness and Black activism and things like that is something that we must be mindful of. Yes. Yeah. If that makes sense. I don't know.
It makes sense. And I think being mindful of that and figuring out ways of intervening, whatever that might be, in this, because it's become a game, which it's not a game.
Yes.
To put it, state that more than obvious, but it's not a game. It is real intense, material, existential, historical consequences. And if Black studies can mobilize at some level, and hopefully at some real depth around that question, I feel a little bit better about the world. So I hope people hear that and are already on that path, because I think what you just spoke to is really important. So thank you for that.
Yeah, my pleasure and pain.
It's always hard to wrap up, rhetorically, those like, that was a great point. No, it was a despairing point, but it was well put.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for your time. I've really loved this conversation. I was looking forward to it, and this has just been fantastic. I appreciate you, taking time out of your midweek day, beginning of the semester, and walking through these questions in your own way, and really offer me and anyone who listens to this just so much to think about. So I appreciate you.
Yeah, I appreciate you as well. Thank you so much. This is I love like podcasts just as like a form of media. So I'm always looking to support it. Yeah.
All right. Well, I know I speak for Ashley when I say I'm really happy to have you in this series. So.
Yay. Good. Thank you.
All right. So have a great rest of your day.
Okay. You too.
All right. Bye-bye.